Todd. Apologies in advance for this. I'm shooting it rather quickly. It's going to be informal. I'm not going to do a bunch of editing, so hopefully I will seem coherent. It's fairly early in the morning as I record this, but I had some ideas that came up. Not really ideas. I had some comments on my video that I just posted as I'm recording this the day before on some tips and tricks in regards to hex crawling. Got a couple of good comments. One of them had a fairly involved question. So since I had time before, I have to get busy with other things, and I was inspired. I thought, well, let me try to make a quick video to talk about a couple of things that were brought up, and we'll see where it goes from there. So the first comment was from, Fluffy the Griffin. And I'm just going to read his comment. He says, in my games, the populated regions all have a farming village per hex. It's when you get beyond to the uncharted lands that the real adventure starts. The entire game of Skyrim is about 2/3 of a 6-mile hex. I tell my players that little fact, and suddenly that puts hex distance into perspective. So I had thought about Skyrim, or I'd seen that posted online about Skyrim. Oh, all Skyrim fits inside of a single 6-mile hex. I didn't think to mention it in the video, but then after Fluffy the Griffin brought it up, I went back and kind of dug into it a little bit. And it's kind of interesting. It's not quite as cut and dried, maybe, as you might see from, if you go on Reddit, I think is maybe where I saw it, or somewhere else, and they'll throw out the Skyrim fits inside a 6-mile hex. But it's interesting in a way, I think, that pertains to the hex map experience. So let me go through it as far as I understand it. Hopefully it will make sense, and hopefully I'm not too far wrong. And then we can draw some things from it, I think. What I've seen the most part for when people establish a number or a size for Skyrim, I've seen a couple different attempts or a couple different methods used. I think the one that comes up with the most concrete, hardcore numbers comes from using a height map, or the Skyrim height map. What the height map is, it's essentially a black and white picture that just shows relative heights from sea level, or I suppose below sea level. I guess it can be arbitrary. It looks like clouds a lot, and the darker the color, or the more black, the deeper it is, the lower it is, and the more white, the higher it is. So you end up with this kind of puffy, cloudy, sort of abstract image that represents heights. And a lot of games use it. Role-playing games oftentimes will use it for things like generating maps. They're really neat. You can go into Photoshop and create some random clouds and then turn those into continents and islands, and there's all kinds of stuff in that, and it's used a lot in games development. So I think Bethesda uses it for Skyrim, uses it for a bunch of their other games as well. And knowing that height map, the height map is then divided into units that have fixed sizes, and those units can be converted into essentially foot measurements, so you can see what the size of the height map is. And I think when I saw one of the stack exchanges where they had broke it all down, it ends up being about 14 miles, or at least 14 miles maybe in the long way. I think it's a rectangle as opposed to a square, but essentially 14 miles by some other number of miles wide. And you think, okay, bam, case closed. But other folks have used a different approach to trying to measure out the size of Skyrim. So if this first approach, where we're looking at the height map, I'm going to call it the programmatic approach, we're literally looking at it mechanically. Here's the height map they use, and right, we can calculate, they divide into cells, then divide into feet, and bam, there you have it. Another method people have used is actually measuring things that they see in game. So, for example, taking the size of a building, saying, okay, we can figure out the size of the building, and I've seen different things. Okay, we'll take the size of the door. We know about how tall a door is. Then we can take that size of the door, compare it to the size of the walls, and then eventually you get around to, you can take this unit, and you have a big enough measuring stick that you then convert it out, and you can then push that across the map and get your sizing from there. And I think actually those numbers make Skyrim seem even smaller, but maybe they vary. So I would say that we're looking at, maybe we call that the descriptive method, because essentially you're looking at the symbology that's on the map and using that to calculate how far away you are. The third one is then saying, okay, I would call it more the experiential method. Take their player avatar, say, okay, from this place to this place, and I'm just going to walk it. And I can look at then and see how long it takes me to walk at a walking pace. I can make some calculation about how fast a character walks. Once I have that distance mapped out, I can then apply that distance to various other distances on the map, and I can come up with a sizing. And I think that one comes up to a much larger size. And in a lot of the discussions going around all these three things, often it's about the accuracy about it, or give or take, or just stating, oh, here are these different ones. But for me, it was interesting because, kind of like I'm trying to show here, is you have basically three levels. You have this mechanical level, which to me is analogous to this zoomed out when you're looking at the piece of paper and you just have a tiny little 6 mile hexes and you just have one symbol on it. Everything seems very small. That to me is that programmatic view. The hex map, it's just for mechanical use and to make some quick and dirty calculations, right? It's not the experienced reality for your players. Players aren't hopping over lines in between hexes and seeing symbols, right? It's merely a tool for us. When you get to that descriptive level, where you're looking at it taking, oh, look at the size of kind of what this symbolic house looks like, and then you extrapolate out and you get it that way. That's kind of like that second level where you're doing, as I talked about in the video yesterday, you're listing out some of the things that are maybe not the main feature. If the main feature is hills, but we have these other features. Oh, we have a river, we've got a village, we've got a dungeon. And at that level, just looking at it, they kind of, you can think about them that they're close together just because they're on the page and they're all just, as someone said in another comment, which I'll get to, they're all just seem to be squished into this one hex. It's almost like they're right up against each other. Still seems kind of small, but the scope is opened up a bit from just a hill. But then you have that third one, which is the actual experiential, fictional level of the players, which I was kind of talking about, that you have 31 square miles in here. Things can actually be quite distant, even though as a crow flies, they may be within this one hex. Those distances can be much vaster than maybe they appeared on the other levels. Back to Skyrim, just briefly, it seems like Bethesda used some tricks. So even though programmatically, maybe it's not that far away as the computer program sees it, but when you're playing it in the game, it actually is far away because the internal game clock and other cues they give you when you're actually walking around make it seem like hours and hours are going by. Even though if you're going to look at it another level and think, wow, it's not that far. But the game, it doesn't, that whatever that programmatic distance used is not the distance that they've designed for you to feel. In the same way, people have commented that the buildings on the outside that people were using for these symbolic measuring tools, that buildings are often bigger on the inside than they are on the outside, that cities now aren't necessarily, or towns aren't necessarily, the actual size inside isn't necessarily what they show you from the outside. In other words, there are lots of tricks that make it a little bit more complicated, but it's interesting because I think it highlights those different levels of abstraction, from sort of the high-end abstraction where it's just a single symbol to more symbolic abstraction where you're listing out those details, but there still is not much spatial distances. And then the experience level in which those spatial distances really come to the fore, and you go from just looking at it like, oh, it's just 6 miles, 6 mile hex, to no, there's really 31 square miles here. So that's the first part. The second question that came up, and let me see if I can look at it, was from Oddcore. And this is a little bit involved. His question was, how long would you say you like to spend in a hex, in a game that uses a hex map, a hex crawl, if that is the right term? The context is, they've been playing an OSR-ish 2-player GM-less sandbox game using the Knave rule set with some slight changes, and they've been using a hex map for it. For them, having a feature in every hex ended up making the map very busy and sort of slowed travel down. So they ended up rolling for a feature every time they got 3 hexes away from a hex that already had a feature. And then I'm just going to skip around a little bit. Of course, they've heard the advice about having multiple features in a hex, but they find it confusing. So essentially the question was, after all that, is how do you keep all this stuff going in your hex and make it readable? Well, so there's a couple things here. Like I said before, always go with what's comfortable for your game, right? Take all advice, including mine, with a grain of salt. If my advice doesn't sound like it's going to work for you, ditch it, right? Do what works. If for your game and this 2-player GM-less system, it makes more sense and is more comfortable and easier to manage, easier to play, that you just have one feature every couple of hexes, great. Go with that. Don't, like I said in the other video, don't just go with this other thing because you feel like you have to. It's just going to become a slog. Now, that being said, if you wanted to put hexes and put more features in, you're wondering, how do I show that on the map? Well, you don't show everything on the map. What you mostly end up seeing is hexes will be numbered. So you'll look at it and you might say, depending on the size of your map, there'll be, horizontal numbers, vertical numbers, you cross-reference them and you say, oh, this is hex 1.1, if you're right in a corner or however you're beginning your numbering system. Then you'll have your overall hex map, but then you'll look at that 1.1 or 1.1, and you'll have a list, some kind of document somewhere, and then in that document we'll have, oh, here's 1.1, and here are the things inside of it. So you're not meant to throw everything onto that single hex map and keep adding all that stuff in there. The hex map is like your first level of reference, and then you go to that second level of reference, which is checking to see, oh, there's something in there. And you can use that whether you're putting features in every hex or not. So essentially what you could do as a GM, or in this case, if you're a player / GM, you're moving a new hex, you look at that one, oh, that's hex 2.7. Now we'll go cross-reference it on 2.7. And at that point, you could actually, if you're using tables, you could roll some dice and then determine right then and there, here are the things that are in hex 2.7. Go to your document, maybe an Excel document or something might make sense, a spreadsheet where you can, sort by these numbers or do some other thing. Oh, what the farts? I don't know what's going on with my camera. It died on me again. And this time I did not have a backup. So let me try to finish this off. I got to figure out what's going on with my camera. Maybe the battery is just fried. I don't know. It's not an old camera, so I don't know. I don't know why it's doing this thing. And last time when it did this, yesterday, I had it plugged into power. So I assumed that, well, maybe I plugged it into a power source that was too hot and it just was overloading it. Because the problem I have with this camera, as much as I like it, is if you're on battery power, the battery power doesn't last very long. But even if I go to USB power, the rate of the charge from USB, at least in the outlets I was plugging it into, did not seem to match or keep up with the power it was consuming. So again, I was finding the battery would still be running it down. Usually not at the rate of, during a video, it would run down. But when I was trying to use it as a webcam, which is one of the features of the camera, for my gaming nights, because it's a little bit just nicer than my regular webcam, it wouldn't last. At the end of the 2-hour session, or before my 2-hour session was over, it would be shutting down, even though I'd had it plugged in and supposedly it had a full battery. Maybe this battery is just screwy. I got to get another one. In any case, I'm going to probably throw up some random old movie footage that I can find. And now I think I've even lost track of where I was. But essentially, going back to the question from Oddcore, you have your overall hex map. You use some numbers to track, to identify the hexes. Then you use another document where you can fill in the features of those hexes. And I think as a GM, you can also use that to put in notes for what's happening in those hexes. Okay, the party traveled through hex 1.7. Here are the things that happened there. I can kind of make some comments and I can know, okay, that happened in 1.7. Next time they travel through 1.7, I can go back to there and say, oh, these are the things they did. And that might help me think about, well, what were the consequences of whatever they did? By the same token, it can be not only a tool for keeping track of the stuff that you're populating there initially, but also when you need to keep track of where you've been, what you've done for consequences, or just for logging your adventures. You can do it that way. So that you have the hex map on one hand, and then you have some kind of document, maybe a spreadsheet, whatever works best for you on the other. And then you use those two documents together. And I think if you look at there's the Land of Nod, which is a very famous design that's just all hexes, and I think the first couple are free, so you can see how he does it or how they do it. You can take a look and see kind of how things are done. Judges Guild. I hate to bring up Judges Guild because they're great, but I have issues with the current owner of the IP, so I don't want to. I don't really feel like sending them folks to buy their stuff. But Judges Guild, you can see how they've done it, and some of their old school materials have hex crawl, are very heavy into hex crawling, and you can see how they lay out their maps versus the details. But that's how you can track it. If you have other questions about this stuff, please let me know. I'm happy to do kind of a Q&A episode if some come up. This one is really off the cuff, and I knew it would be a bit sloppy. Now it's going to be even sloppier since my camera died. I'm just going to roll with it. Hopefully you'll find it useful. Have a great rest of your day, night, whenever you're watching or listening to this. Talk to you later. Game on.